All right. Hello, everybody. I am here. This is Dr. Annette Feravich, and I am live with you on YouTube, my YouTube channel, Dr. Annette Feravich, healthymindbodyspirit.net. And we are here to talk about more philosophical classroom. I put up universal traits. We're really still talking about adaptation or adaptive. I'll call them mental mechanisms. That's where we left off on Thursday, right? But where we are leading into, and this is important, we are leading into the concept of what are the traits that we have that everybody shares. Why do we want to talk about this? We're talking about groupthink, and we're talking about, all the situation, right? And how the situation affects us. And even in adaptive defense mechanisms, what are we talking about? Or mental mechanisms. We are talking about what are these kind of universal drives that we have. I keep wanting to talk about Erickson's, and I got to get to Erickson's stages, but I don't think we're going to do it in the philosophical classroom. I think we're going to do it in the critical thinking classroom. That's got to be coming up pretty soon, though. Oh, that's chipped. But here, let's go ahead and finish up what we were talking about those adaptive defense mechanisms or adaptive mental mechanisms. The whole idea that I am trying to get in this philosophical classroom is how do we rise above this kind of group think? And there are some things that are naturally universal in each one of us, as we've been talking about a lot of these natural tendencies that we have. To respond to reward in a certain way, to respond to punishment in a certain way, to respond to classical conditioning in a certain way, to respond to instrumental conditioning in a certain way, in ways that affect our emotions, in ways that affect our behaviors, in ways that affect our thoughts, right? And there are, like this self-fulfilling prophecy, many natural tendencies that we have to act in certain ways. So those are what we want to focus a little bit on. Now, these natural tendencies to react in certain ways, some of them are hardwired and highly unchangeable. But most of them are not that hardwired, and most of them really are changeable. All right, so let's talk about them. Where we left off here is I was trying to make sure that you understood what I was saying as it relates to, let me get my slide up here, as it relates to these adaptive mental mechanisms. Specifically, I still don't have my slide up here. There we go. Okay, so specifically, we are talking about those mental mechanisms that are automatic for us. We don't have to spend any time thinking about them. They come automatically. Now, these mental mechanisms, we were talking about them as they relate to Freudian theory, right? And so these mental mechanisms are, as we see, some of them are poorly adaptive that we learned through negative circumstances. And what these poorly adaptive defense or mental mechanisms aid in is actually avoiding any problem solving, right? Okay, so there we have, in the first column there, we've got poorly adaptive defense mechanisms or mental mechanisms. Freud and his daughter identified those. Anna Freud identified them. They are important to let us know. And in particular, when you're talking about mental health, they let us know when we are off track. We're not seeing things honestly. Why aren't we? How do we know? Because you're defensive, because you're using projection. All of your undesirable traits you're putting onto somebody else. So I can see in your behavior when you are repressing, you're acting like a child is what you're doing, right? Or when you are suppressing, you're not remembering things that you should remember, right? Or when you are projecting, you are defensive. Let's take a look at some of those. I want to look at those a little bit more closely with my eyeballs, as opposed to with something else. When you are passive aggressive, right? So you really want to say something, but you don't dare say it. So instead you just boil on the inside. Not a healthy way to deal with stress and pressure. Acting out on the same underneath action level there. Acting out. So acting out is acting like a child when you are an adult. Having a temper tantrum, breaking things, punching things. All of that is physical behavior that is demonstrating your unpleasantness or your disagreeableness, right? Okay, so all of those come without any training. They come without any training. We may see them as examples. We do learn them, but I don't have to be trained to act in a way that protects myself. Defensive. Now, when I have many things coming at me, I end up becoming more and more defensive. And then that behavior becomes learned and automatic. All right. So there's a difference here. We have mechanisms that protect ourselves, and those mechanisms come on board automatically. But the way that those mechanisms are shaped, it's by our environment. When we utilize poorly adaptive mechanisms versus highly adaptive mechanisms, they're all available. Both of these, they're available. But when we utilize one over the other, that's learned. All of these are available. When we utilize one over the other, that is learned. All right. So this starts bordering on the concept of today's topic, universal traits. We universally across the board want to protect ourselves and defend ourselves. That's across the board. What is learned is if we do that in poorly adaptive ways, or if we do that in highly adaptive ways. All right. Okay. So we spent some time talking about the poorly adaptive mental mechanisms or defense mechanisms, poorly adaptive defense mechanisms. Now we want to talk about the highly adaptive ones. Remember what we said. All of these are really, they are intuitive. They are naturally born. They are put in our DNA. So remember what we had here, the three broad classes of adaptive defense mechanisms. They are involuntary, but they are healthy, right? We don't have to be taught to seek social support when we are feeling bad. We don't have to be taught to problem solve when we have a problem, number two. And we don't have to be taught to engage in these mental mechanisms. We are taught to utilize either highly adaptive mental mechanisms or poorly adaptive mental mechanisms. Nevertheless, we are inclined automatically to use these involuntary mental mechanisms. Okay, let's go to the good ones now. The good ones. Let's go to the mental mechanisms that are highly adaptive. They are starting with anticipation. Anticipation allows us to perceive that which may be dangerous as well as that which is beneficial. In this way, we are able to master conflicts. In each small step of mastery comes self-determination and perseverance. What? What does all that mean? What are you saying, Dr. Feravich? I don't even know. Sounds like you're reading. And I am. And I did read that. I did read that because I wanted to make sure these definitions that I've had for a while, and I've put some thought into these definitions, into phrasing them in ways. I just don't feel like this is the greatest look for me. In ways that rephrasing this in ways that I think are really understandable and also can give me some really good examples. Just give me a second. I have to there's a wardrobe fix. Now, it's not an emergency. It's just a fix. So give me a second. I'll let you observe and look at this slide for just a minute. And let me just, because I'm just not comfortable. So give me a second. Okay, I am back. All right, so anticipation, the idea here is that I always equate anticipation to a Michigan, what do you call them? Michigan turnarounds, right? Michigan turnaround, or no, not a Michigan turnaround. I don't equate it to that. To the roundabout. A roundabout. All right. So anticipation. How do you do in a roundabout? That might be a good indication. Actually, I think of your ability to, my eyes are really dry. I got up early this morning. I didn't get to go to bed too late last night, but I got up early this morning. But I think that the roundabout is a good measure of your even desire to anticipate anything. Okay. So are you the person who knows how to yield in the roundabout, where you're supposed to yield? Do you know when you're supposed to go? And do you know when you're supposed to stop? And are you paying attention to the traffic? And can you anticipate how fast or slow that car is coming around that roundabout for you to go? So a yield sign might be, but the roundabout just complicates the yield sign just a little bit more, right? Are you paying attention when you are driving, and do you anticipate? I didn't say do you worry. I didn't say are you paranoid? Are you overly anxious about other drivers? What I said is anticipate. This is a highly adaptive mental mechanism, so it's not about being anxious or being worried. Remember, it's not just about what is dangerous, but do you know how to anticipate what is beneficial to you? Are you a few steps ahead? Can you make some predictions? That's what anticipation is about. Are you able to predict what is coming up that's good for you in the next few minutes, even? That's anticipation. Not in the next year, although that's anticipation too. It can be, right? Goal oriented. But you change that level of your goals as you get closer to those goals, right? Anticipation is knowing what's dangerous for you and positive or benefits you right now in this immediate moment. And then you're a few steps ahead so you can take advantage of it, right? You take advantage of that opportunity because you know it's coming somehow, right? You know the person with that smile on their face is the owner of the company, not the janitor. And if I know that when I'm out and about, it might be to my advantage and I might benefit from knowing that information in advance, right? So that's anticipation. Okay, the next one, altruism. Altruism. Oh, let me finish up this next thought. I'm sorry, this last thought in anticipation. You are able to master conflicts because you anticipate what the next person is going to say or how they are going to react. Is that comment going to get that person to punch you in the face, or is that comment going to de-escalate? So you anticipate how your comments are going to affect somebody else and what they are going to do in return, right? So that's how you can master conflicts, by anticipating. And then the benefit is self-determination and perseverance. When I get those things right, I think that person is going to help me. I think that person is going to hurt me. When I get those things right, what do? I persevere. I keep going. I think I've got this. I think I've got it. Because you are making predictions with anticipation. So you can't always be right in your predictions, right? But are you right a lot more often? And are you getting right more and more often in what you predict? Okay? All right. So mastery, anticipation helps you master things. Altruism deems individual desires as bad. My desires are bad, and others' needs and desires are good. It's a priority thing. Altruism, you don't have to believe it. You don't have to be altruistic. But when you are, you say, I put others before myself. Always, always. Even to my detriment. And what this does is it transforms perceptions. What's the reward? It transforms your perception. How can that be? How can being altruistic, how can deeming my own selfish needs as being bad and other people's needs as being good, how is it that can transform us? How can it transform us? It transforms us because when we are focused on the needs of others, the transformation comes in understanding their situation, their plight, the ability to have compassion, the ability to empathize with that person. And what you literally do, you literally trigger mirror neurons. Mirror neurons are those neurons, I'm pretty sure we talked about it in this class, are those neurons that activate when I perform a behavior or see you perform a behavior. What is it that transforms me? It is that I get myself in your shoes. When I put you first, I get myself in your shoes. Now, if I put you first and you are an employer, right? Okay, that's one thing. It can transform me into somebody who's understanding the corporate business world. If I am altruistic, put other people's needs first, who are that have some kind of physical disability, I put myself in their shoes. And this gives me a new perspective, empathy, and that is transforming. It is because we have a mechanism by which we empathize with everybody first before we think of ourselves. So I'm able to step outside of myself again and again and again to see new light, to see a situation differently. That is transforming. That is transforming. So altruism is the ability to positively influence others' lives because of negative. Oh, no, sorry, that's not it. Wrong. Wrong definition there. Sorry. There we go. I am reading and I shouldn't read. Okay. All right. Humor. Humor has been described as the ultimate defense. Why? Because when it is mature humor, it allows me to laugh at myself in a way that reduces my pain or my distress and reduces yours as well, right? So it's ultimate defense. Why? Because it allows me to turn something that is painful or distressing for you or for me into something that is pleasant. That is mature humor. It doesn't distract somebody from the problem, right? It's not making fun so that I don't have to, right? It's not a clown. A clown makes fun and has got the tears of a clown behind the scenes. It's not that. This humor is laughing at yourself. The ability to be able to take your pain or your distress, as many comedians do, right? And instead of avoiding the pain and distress, you look at it head on. You face suffering and misfortune head on and essentially laugh in the face of your own suffering and your own misfortune. Humor, or that's humor, sorry. Sublimation. Let me make sure I've got all this up there. All right, sublimation. Sublimation is when I take something that is a problem and I had to make sure because I had to make sure. Yeah. So I take what has been a problem and I produce social and cultural achievements from it. If I had traumatic experiences in my life as a child, what do? I help other children. If I've had financial hardships and have been able to overcome, I understand what that is like. And what do? I turn this bad event in my life into something positive. This is the energy that behind achievements lead often to exciting, creative, and passionate lives. This is somebody who makes music, right? You don't have to become a counselor, right? You don't, if you've, just because you've experienced those things, you might write music. You might write literature. You might make art pieces. You might become a police officer. You might become a social worker. There are all kinds of ways that you give back. Sublimation is giving back because you know what that suffering is all about. Suppression is putting something I'm looking at this because I did put that definition in the wrong place in my notes. And I don't even know why I'm using them because it really kind of, it's only making me mad that I'm looking at my notes and I'm like, they're older notes. All right, suppression. Suppression is putting something on the back burner, but only temporary. You will notice that suppression is one of the only mechanisms mature mental mechanisms or defense mechanisms, whichever you want to call it, that is on both lists. So it can be poorly adaptive. Suppression can be poorly adaptive, but suppression can also be highly adaptive. This is putting something on the back burner, but when it's highly adaptive, you're putting it on the back burner for a short period of time. When it's poorly adaptive, you put it on the back burner indefinitely. Poorly adaptive suppression is, I forget about it, right? I've forgotten about it. This is when people suppress bad events, for example, in their childhood. What do? They put it on the back burner to forget about it, right? Not if it's highly adaptive. Highly adaptive is, you know what, I've been arguing all week and I have to get this proposal done. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about this again on Monday after I've got this proposal done. So suppression is only for a short period of time, and it's scheduled and organized when it's highly adaptive. I'll get to it later, and I never get to it when it's poorly adaptive. Okay? All right. Now, what they did then is, so first of all, Valent defined those mental mechanisms, right, as being involuntary, and some of them as being highly adaptive, and some of them as being poorly adaptive. So that's what he did first. And he used a compare and contrast when he was contrasting them to Freud's defense mechanisms. But then what he wanted to do was he wanted to look to see what were the outcomes. When somebody does engage in highly adaptive mental mechanisms, how are they adaptive? What is the benefit? If it's adaptive, there should be some benefit to it. And so what he did was he took a look closely at 3 different research groups. So or 3 different groups of participants, not research groups, but groups of participants. So the first group there would be these are college students from Harvard. So you can imagine now what Valent wants to do is he wants to get a series of individuals who are considered to be smart or not so smart, and poor or well-to-do, and intelligent or not so intelligent. Okay? All right. So taking a look at, did I say that? Smart or not so smart? Right. Yeah. College. And then poor or pretty wealthy. And then looking specifically at IQ. All right. So there is a definition or an example of those participants that that Valent studied to see what were the outcomes of individuals who had these highly or poorly adaptive mental mechanisms. So the college sample from Harvard, clearly we would have individuals who would be thought to be maybe higher than average intelligence. They actually weren't. They actually were average intelligence. Harvard College sample. 368 students volunteered for this, but this sample had money. All right, so high socioeconomic status. They had money. They were all born about 1920. There was a core city sample. These core city sample had both low SES, so that is low, they were poor, right? And they also had IQ that was below average. On average, about 95. The average IQ score is 100. And then finally, there is what is called the Terman Women sample. Now, this is an interesting sample. If you ever wanted to study, they've asked them a series of questions, but you can see that they've asked these women a series of questions since around 1910. And they've been studying this sample and asking them questions, and then replacing the ones who pass away with new ones that have an IQ about 151 on average. So a high IQ. These are above average. These are geniuses, right? They are also women. So now we can also compare gender differences. And there were 672 of these individuals There were 456 from the core city sample, you can see. These were gifted women with an IQ of, on average, 151 and born at around 1910. No SES here because they can come from any economic. Women who are smart can come from poor, middle class, upper class. So that was not important. Just the same way that Harvard sample was not intellectually gifted either. All right. Then what they did was they measured them for highly adaptive mental mechanisms or poorly adaptive mental mechanisms. And they followed them throughout their years to look at things like how well did they cope? When they had life circumstances, were they better able to, if they had highly adaptive mechanisms, to make things work out? Were they suicidal? Did they die earlier, right? All of these things associated with one's ability to I'm just making sure. So what time did we start? We started at 2:00, right? Here. So 12:31. Yeah, we started at 2:00. Okay. All right. So here are the final tally of what those adaptive mental mechanisms do for us. So let's take a look at this. The very first thing up there is, so these were outcomes. What they did was they examined these mental mechanisms and compared them with childhood poverty, physical limitations. So do they have any physical disabilities, of old age? They looked at stressful life events. And because these individuals lived through World War II, many of the men fought in World War II. They looked at the effects of severe combat on those who had poor adaptive mental mechanisms compared to those who had highly adaptive mental mechanisms. And what they found out was men considered to have the most adaptive defense mechanisms were just as likely to come from low SES families as those with the least. Okay, so it did not matter what your SES was. Again, you might have highly adaptive mental mechanisms in the lowest class, in the middle class, in the upper class, and you might have poorly adaptive mental mechanisms in upper class, in middle class, or in lower class. There was no difference in the number of adaptive mental mechanisms that individuals had based on class. No difference. All right? Okay, so that was good information. Number 2 there, as adults, 1% with the most adaptive defense mechanisms compared with 21% of the least adaptive defense mechanisms were in the lowest social class. So, what does that mean? Well, it means that only 1% of individuals who had poorly adaptive mental mechanisms were in the lowest class. But Dr. Feravich, didn't you just say that they come from any class? Yes, but over time, what happens? Over time, individuals who have highly adaptive mental mechanisms move out of the lowest class. So they can come from any class, but as they develop over time, individuals with highly adaptive mental mechanisms move out of the lowest class. That's what's happening. So if you want to change classes, the best way to move up in social status, in social class, would be to adopt those highly adaptive mental mechanisms. 21% of those people with the least adaptive remained in the lowest social class. Number 3, those that had the most adaptive defense mechanisms were least likely to suffer depression later in life. Okay, so that's pretty clear. If you have highly adaptive mental mechanisms, you are less likely to suffer depression. Makes sense. And then the last one there, those in the study who fought in World War II and suffered PTSD suffered significantly fewer symptoms if they were identified as having highly adaptive mental mechanisms. All right, so what is that saying? It's saying that, remember what they said at the beginning there, that they were looking at individuals in combat. So they looked for individuals who went to World War II. They had already separated them into highly adaptive or poorly adaptive mental mechanisms. Individuals who had highly adaptive mental mechanisms were less likely to suffer PTSD. And in fact, almost none of them suffered PTSD if they had highly adaptive mental mechanisms. And they also had significantly fewer symptoms of PTSD when they had, after World War II, when they had these highly adaptive defense mechanisms. Okay. Then what we have there are, what are these characteristics that these individuals have? All right, so we can see that that they're altruistic, that they may have these, that they may also be more, have anticipation, utilize those very specific skills that we talked about there, those 5 different mental mechanisms. But in general, what do these people have? What's doing it? What actually is doing it? Well, these individuals are oriented towards the future. Okay. All right. So they are goal oriented. What can I accomplish? Okay. They are efficient in problem solving. So they get and they tackle the issue. They're less likely to procrastinate. They're more likely to understand what resources they have available, more likely to ask questions. They are able to get things done. They are more resistant to stress. So they don't experience stress in the same way. They see stress as an opportunity, maybe sometimes an obstacle that they can, a challenge. They see stress as a challenge. They perceive reality without distortions. Okay, so we are talking about in the critical thinking classroom about optimism and pessimism. And if I'm overly optimistic, that can cause problems. I need to be optimistic, but when I'm overly optimistic, I distort reality. And when I distort reality, it makes it very difficult to know what is it that I can count on. What is true? If I distort reality, I don't know what I really can depend on. I don't know the skills that I have. I go and feed myself compliments over and over again, but I don't really know if I have those skills or not. All right. So what we want to do is we want to perceive reality without distortions. So we really do understand what that person is saying, what that person is doing. What about me? Have I made improvements? Do I understand truth? Those kinds of things. These individuals who are highly adaptive are more empathetic. We already said that. Why? Because they can take on the issues, the position, understand what other people are going through. And they also have greater emotional experiences. So they experience work, love, and play at greater degrees. Remember, no, not in this class. We were talking about this in the critical thinking class, where we do have individual highs and lows as far as emotional experiences. And what we're saying, so individuals who go up and down can have low lows in their emotional experiences, but they have high highs as well. And that these individuals actually have greater emotional experiences related to those things, their work. So emotionally feeling good about things, emotionally making it a bad situation into something better, or enjoying your work. So those kinds of things where individuals are proactively doing things to help increase that those highly adaptive mechanisms that individuals are utilizing. Okay, all right. Now I wanted to show you, to get you to be thinking about, so we're talking about groupthink, right? and some of the ways that we might be able to break free from these, bonds of group think. And so what I have there is what is called a Pennebaker paradigm and some of the outcomes of this Pennebaker paradigm. So that those are some. It was researched by a person whose last name was Pennebaker. Can't remember the first name though right now. Yeah, I can't remember the first name. Um, and so that's why it's called the Pennebaker paradigm. But this has to do with writing and writing down those things that you are part of traumatic experiences. That a lot of times people suppress those traumatic experiences, but they're always festering underneath the surface for anybody, unless we deal with them and deal with them in ways that we confront them or go through them, right? So that we have an understanding, we come to an understanding with why that event occurred in my life, and then are able to better move on into a healthier place, right? Okay, so what is the Pennebaker paradigm? This is writing about traumatic events. So individuals wrote about one traumatic event every night for 7 nights for about 15 minutes. And they didn't repeat it. They just kept adding sort of to it, but doing kind of a stream of conscience so that they weren't planning what they were going to say. They were letting the thoughts flow. So for 15 minutes, if somebody didn't come to you, you sat there for 15 minutes and tried to write whatever thoughts were coming to your mind. And what we found out was that this is a wonderful exercise for being able to sort of wash off or disregard those experiences. Not disregard, but kind of cleanse yourself of those experiences so that you can get the most out of them and then end up reaping some healthy benefits as well. Let's take a look at that. I'm going to leave that up there for just a minute. Let me just take a minute here. Just give me a second. I need to get a drink of something because I am feeling like my blood sugar is low. Hold on. And I have something in my eye, so I'll be right back. Okay, I am sorry about that, but I really did have something in my eye. I think my eye is still red a little bit, but I did get it out. I had two loosey hairs in there. There she is right there. Two loosey hairs. And the other thing was, I had to get something in my system. I was up early this morning and didn't get a break in between to eat something. And that's not good. Okay. Let's talk about what we have here. So the Pennebaker paradigm is writing about a traumatic event. So let's stop for a minute on there. On that thought, I had to change my sweater too because it was getting hot. As I was sitting here, I was like, what am I talking about? I didn't even know. Okay. Yes, I do. But I was getting a little lightheaded there for a second. Okay. So, see, apparently I don't get angry when I get lightheaded, though. I just get silly. Okay, so Pennebaker paradigm. What are we doing? Writing about a traumatic event for 7 nights. Now, what happens here is very interesting because if I wrote about a traumatic event, first of all, let's talk about our natural inclinations because that's what we're talking about, these universal traits. What's our natural inclination? If I experience something traumatic, my natural inclination is to want to forget about it, to not think about it. Now, some people ruminate, right? But in either case, rumination is thinking over and over again about a negative event. Some people ruminate. Some people put it on the back burner, right? It kind of depends on the traumatic event and when you experienced it. If you experienced a traumatic event yesterday, it's going to be playing on your mind more, right? If you experience a traumatic event 20 years ago, you're not going to be thinking about it. And likely your brain has done you a favor in helping you forget about it, right? Now, a lot of times the first thing that people go into therapy saying is I don't know why I have to rehash all of these old things, right? Why do I have to rehash these events? I'm doing fine. I just want to know how to keep doing what I'm doing and not feel sad or depressed or anxious or not be afraid to meet people or not be afraid of commitment and attachment or all of those things, right? I don't want to have to think about what I put in my past. Just help me deal with what I have in front of me right now. Unfortunately, it doesn't work that way, but it's not as hard as everyone thinks. Everyone thinks that you have to mull over something with a therapist over and over in order for you to understand what the traumatic event is. And that just simply is not the case. You could, it is feasible to get rid of all of the baggage that comes with a traumatic event through this writing exercise. It doesn't work for everybody, but it certainly does demonstrate for a lot of people improvement. Even if it's not the entire solution, we see improvement. So what's the improvement? Let's talk about it a little bit. What we end up seeing here is, look at the time over here. What we end up seeing here is, I didn't see it. Is that when people write about a traumatic experience for a week, whatever, they're going to feel worse. It makes sense. I have just been, regurgitating, ruminating, mulling over the worst experience in my life to write about it for 15 minutes for 7 straight days. The first reaction that you're going to have is an increase in feeling bad. It is. So you want to make sure that you think about that, right? When I start writing, I have to be aware that it's going to make me feel bad, that I'm not going to want to do it. I'm going to think in my head, what is the purpose of this? Why do I need to rehash all of these old bad feelings? But what we found is that these individuals not only increased their levels of satisfaction with life, happiness, decreased their depression, but they were getting involved with things. They had, let me read some of these things. Just one sec. I have got these notes here that I didn't pull over. Which aren't there. Ugh. They're there. Actually, you know what? They did not write for 7 days. I'm just looking at that. I'm looking at the research right now and getting my notes back up here. Sorry about that. I put those notes. Well, it doesn't matter. Put up those notes for you, but I had better notes, but they were just notes someplace else. So they wrote for 4 days for 15 minutes. Initially, those in the experimental condition that were writing felt worse. But about 2 weeks after the study, the storytelling group experienced benefits, including so they had an increase in happiness, decrease in depression, but they also had fewer physician visits. After writing the story, they were literally getting sick less often, and they also had less stress talking about the difficult event. What is the reason why? Well, the reason why is because what does it do? It organizes your thoughts about the event. And when those thoughts are organized, you can begin to say, really bad, not so bad, learning lesson, right? Cause effect. If I don't do that again, if I do this again, it organizes your thoughts around that event. It also changes your social dynamics. It gives you a feeling of a sense of control. You took the control over writing your thoughts. You take the situation back. And so what that does is it really changes your social dynamics. Because why? Because you have reorganized, rethought, and also you have disinhibited your thoughts and feelings. Why can you talk about it more? That tragic event, that trauma, why can you talk about it more? You got used to talking about it. And in that way, you got used to not being so afraid of saying certain things about that event, right? Of saying that I was sexually abused, that my husband didn't meet my needs, that my children have embarrassed me or disrespected me. Getting the words out means that I am not so inhibited in saying that or talking about it or disclosing that information with other people. And so those are some real big benefits. We also saw that there were positive immune system responses, in particular with those individuals who were rated high in hostility. So if you took a look at our critical thinking classroom where we are talking about personality characteristics, hostility is a key characteristic for individuals with heart disease. Well, what we're seeing here is that individuals who were high in hostility were the individuals who benefited the most from writing about these traumatic events. It improved their immune response. Also, individuals who were rated high in alexithymia. Alexithymia is in an inability to be able to interpret other people's emotions. Okay, so just an emotional disconnect. Individuals who had alexithymia also benefited more from writing these down, these traumatic events. You could see how they would. They are getting their feelings out and they are putting words to their feelings as well. If I'm putting words to my feelings, well, then it is highly likely that I am going to be able to express emotions better and interpret emotions better and understand cues that are related to emotions better. Let's take a look at what that chart says there. What does that chart say? So now we've got the two different groups, the writing group and the control group, right? So the writing group is in the green and the control group is in the rust color or orange color, right? So we had a pre-test and a post-test. So these individuals were put in pressure situations, all right? So pressure situations, let me get that up there. And they were looking at whether or not they choked on the next test. So they took a pre-test. Then they increased individuals' worry by putting them in a high pressure situation. And so the high pressure situation was that they had to they had to do a speech is what they had to do. And they had to think about what they wanted to say in their speech. Or they had 10 minutes to sit and write. So 10 minutes to sit or 10 minutes to write about their pressure situation. And then they took the math test again. And what do we see there at the end of the math test? So we've got I'm not looking at the chart there. The pre-test scores and then the percent of errors that individuals had there, right? So those individuals who had to write compared to those individuals who just were sitting there, the control group sitting there, their pre-test scores were similar. They really weren't significantly different. But we can see that as far as the percent of errors go in the second math test, those individuals that got to write about their stressful situation ended up performing, making fewer errors on that post-test. After the pressure situation. So what are we seeing there? It was a study on choking under pressure. Do people choke under pressure? And if I feel like I might choke under pressure, what might help me relieve that stress? And in this case, it's writing about the stress. So we see that this helps reduce errors immediately when I write about what's stressing me. I make less errors on a math test when I write about the stressors, but we can see that we get the benefits as well long term. If I start writing about something that happened years ago, I get benefits in my social relationships. I get benefits in being able to talk more, and I relieve that pressure from the trauma. So all kinds of benefits. So writing when we feel stressed. Okay, all right. So this is a universal way that we might be able to, why am I talking about this, right? Why am I talking about this kind of reducing stress and universal traits? I'm talking about ways that we universally respond to the group and within the group, and ways that we can stand up individually and break free from that group. One way is expressing ourselves in individual ways by writing. What breaks us free from the group? When we have built an individual self that is not defined by that group. Okay, all right. I think that's good. This is Dr. Annette Feravich. We have got 15 minutes before we get, or actually, we've got 12 minutes before we get to our story. We are talking about we are reading the £1,000,000 banknote from Mark Twain. And if you remember, what he did was he gave I think it was a £5 million banknote, but maybe it was a million because that's the name of the book or the title, to a poor person, and he had to get by for a month with a banknote that looked like it didn't belong to him. So let's get to the story. 11 minutes now, probably. This is Dr. Annette Feravich. I will see you in a few. Thanks for joining me. I am the teacher. This is the philosophical classroom. We're going to get to some more universal traits as far as emotions go, but I wanted to talk to you a little bit about trying to figure out ways to break free of this group. All right, this is Dr. Annette Feravich. Thanks for joining me. I will see you back here in just a few.